Lord Young, thank you so much for doing this podcast.
Oh, with pleasure.
And also just being such a big champion for ex-forces, but also just the startup agenda. So I thought, well, why don't we start right at the beginning? How did the enterprise learning, startup funding, all of that sort of stuff come about?
Well, it goes back a lot further than that. My father told me to become a solicitor, and in those days you did what your father told my younger brother, who when he died was chairman of the BBC, to become an accountant, and he set up a firm. So I left school at 16 to become an article clerk. Mm-hmm. I qualified, took 5 years. I practiced for 6 months and hated it and gave it up. So then I got a job at Great Universal Stores, which used to be the biggest mail order company, with thousands of shops all over the place. And I spent 2.5 years as PA to the chairman, which I learned a great deal. Then I went back, and then I hated being employed. So by now it's 1961, so I set up my business. Now in those days, it was so different that when you went out in the evening, you didn't say you worked for yourself, mm-hmm. because everybody thought profit was theft.
Yeah.
If somebody made money, other people lost it. So, but we carried on. Mm-hmm. In the 60s. I sold out in the 70s. I started off again, but the 70s was the decade of strikes, of the IMF coming to London, of the UK being the sick man of Europe. So in 1979, and I said to Keith Joseph at the beginning of 79, if we win the election, I'll mm-hmm. take a 2-year holiday, come in and help you start privatisation. Well, we won, and the first day of the first term, I was with Keith. I became special advisor, SPAD they call it these days. There were only 3 others in government, and I think my age was more than the 3 put together, but that's another matter. Anyway, and I was carrying on doing that, and after about a year, or less even, officials came to me and said, look, we have a real problem that for nearly 20 years, every year, the number of startups has been less than the number of closures. We're down to 750,000 companies. Can you think of something? So I said, of course. So we set up a scheme in which banks would be guaranteed to lend companies, and then I thought anyway, why not help people to start, not just small firms? Mm-hmm. Unemployment was the big problem of the days, and particularly youth unemployment. Mm-hmm. If you could imagine, 400,000 16-year-olds came on the register and got benefit, £15 a week in those days. So they went from 50p pocket money to 15, bringing home the lesson the state looks after you. Anyway, so in the Norman Tebbit asked me to become chairman of the Manpower Services Commission, which was the biggest government agency and dealing with unemployment. And I did 2 things there that I think were really important. One is I changed the whole thing from being sorry for the unemployed to giving opportunities to the unemployed, and the very first of the startup schemes that came along and went on going. And secondly, and this is my biggest regret, I agreed with Keith Joseph, who by then was Education Secretary, and set up a scheme called TVI, which gave technical and vocational education in the school network.
Right.
And we were spending £2 billion or over £1 billion a year on this programme. Of course, when I came back many years later, it all gone. But so we found the way in the 80s that we found a way to really attract people starting working for themselves. I remember one scheme we had, it cost us nearly £10,000 a head to persuade any Oxbridge graduate to come and work for themselves.
Right.
And I remember the great cheer when first one did. Now, of course, it's completely the other way around. You know, they all they want to do is work for themselves. We and so the decade carried on. we had dreamt up the enterprise allowance scheme.
That's right.
Which is, I think, the key to a lot of this. In those days, 3.5 million unemployed. If you were long-term unemployed, that is, unemployed for more than a year, you could, if you wanted to work for yourself, enter the scheme, and all the scheme did was to give you benefit, the same level of benefit, £20 a week in those days, for the next year without the obligation to look for work.
Right.
So you start up. Well, over the years, 250,000 firms started up, and 2 of them, warehouses, one made the FTSE 100.
Fantastic.
So it shows you what 30 years can really do.
Absolutely.
Anyway, things carried on. We got control of unemployment. It came down. I went to DTI, Trade and Industry, after that, and we started up a number of programs which I regret have disappeared. One is Teachers Training College. Every undergraduate teacher had to spend 2 weeks in industry, so at least they know something about it.
Yeah.
And anyway.
And a lot of work's been done, hasn't it, Lord Young, in terms of trying to bridge that gap between industry and education. So it is a big loss that that scheme
it is
disappeared.
a big loss. I mean, the trouble is that teachers who'd never worked outside teaching would find it very difficult to explain the world of work.
Yeah.
By 1989, I told Margaret Thatcher that I've got a wife, I've got to get back to work, you see. Because in those 10 years I was a volunteer, I didn't draw a salary or anything, because I felt I owed it the country. Anyway, then I became chairman of Cable and Wireless for 5 years, and at 64 or so I due to retire. And I went back and started with one room at the bottom of Harley Street and a computer, and started off again.
Oh, bless you.
So I've done startups, so I must, and of course that was my own startups, but then since then I've been funding, helping people to start.
Yeah. So we first met, I think it was around latter end of 2012, 2013, actually it was 2012. And it happened to be when you had just launched one of your reports around startup funding. And it was at number 10, because you were residing at number 10 and supporting the Prime Minister at that time.
To my great surprise, at the age of 78, David Cameron invited me to come into number 10 as his advisor for enterprise. And so, true to form, I only had one idea. I started to produce papers. We did a whole lot of things. In those days, if you worked for yourself and used the front room, when you sold your house, you were liable to tax on it. You couldn't get planning permission. We got rid of all of that. And then I persuaded the Treasury that we would do a program to enable startups to really come. And that was called Startup Loans. And that's got away to a very good start. One morning in 2012, I was driving into the office and listening to Day programme, and there was an ex-soldier there saying how difficult it was to readjust to life, and how difficult it was to get help. So I got into the office, I sent a note down to the Prime Minister. I said, can we start a special part of startup loans for the military? And came back the same day, yes, of course. So Paul Lewis, who had my secretariat, found you, or I suspect you found him.
I sort of found you both. I remember being at the launch of that report and then bouncing over to you and saying, Lord Young, I want to talk to you about something, and that's then Paul Lewis, bless him, he literally almost dragged me back, saying, I think you need to speak to me first, but I managed to get into your office the week after.
You did,
so.
and right away I was sunk. From now onwards I had a new boss. Forget the Prime Minister.
Oh, bless you.
But it's been a very exciting journey, actually, because if you go and spend however many years in the forces, so many come out who cannot adjust to private life.
Yeah.
Because if you're regimented for a long time, you don't have to think. You suddenly come out, you've got to start thinking about what you're going to do. And
Yes.
you know,
And this is where the lifelong work of yours, Lord Young, nobody can even come close to, because
Right.
although, you know, there's this enabler which is around the funding, and it's taken different names over the years. We know it as startup loans funding, which is your brainchild, but you're such an advocate for enterprise learning as well. And I think for the armed forces, that it isn't just about, you know, funding, it's also about understanding the commercial world, and enterprise learning allows us to do that.
Absolutely.
And support that.
And it's really important. In fact, when I was back at DTI, it was called, we called it Department for Enterprise.
Yes.
So, but now that's old hat, because for the very first, a few years ago, small firms were more than any other firms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now they're quite a significant percentage and growing fast. Yes, but if you come out, there are two things. One is you give them people finance to help. But secondly, what do they do with the money other than go down to the pub? So you've got to know something about what a company is, how a bank works, how you keep rudimentary books at the beginning. All these things that make an incredible difference. And I think that was one of the things that attracted me very much.
Thank you. I'd like to bring it back to the startup loans funding, because there's always been, you know, a little bit of uncertainty in the market. What is that about? And I think it's so important to be able to, I mean, the startup loans funding was primarily launched for individuals who would not ordinarily have access to funding through traditional means, such as the banks. Can you tell us about the importance of that? And also, I think it really important about the fact that you insisted and made sure that it was unsecured funding, so that people were able to still feel comfortable.
Yes, the trouble is, over the decades, the banks have changed entirely. When I was starting up, I got an overdraft. Nobody can do that today. So I dreamt up this scheme. The Treasury said no. So about 9 months later, I set it back. The Treasury said no. But the third time, they realised that they weren't going to get away with it. They said yes. And the whole idea applied to any age. It doesn't matter whether you're employed or unemployed. Obviously, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. There are more women, I think, now working for themselves than men. And it was just to be flexible, that anybody who, say, retires, people retiring at 50 and 55, well, what do you do then? They've got a bit of money, they want to work for themselves, let's help them. It was £5,000 a head in those days, and it's gone up now.
So the scheme that you've set up and we've been able to take advantage of, because you know, not everybody needs funding, but should they need funding, it's important that there's access there. It's low interest rate. I know it's government funds, and it's, you know, we approve the business plans, we don't handle the money, but it's still important that it's low interest and it's unsecured. Why was that so important to you, Lord Young?
Because 30% of businesses fail. And there's no point in having a scheme in which you've got a guarantee. You're going to end up with those 30% of startups with people in trouble. And that was the key point about this, that we're giving you a chance. We're not even saying you've got to have money of your own, which was the old scheme. And the great thing, and so we started up one with you, with ex-forces, with us.
And sorry, Lord Young, I was going to mention the fact that with the armed forces, because they've been deployed in different places, the credit history sometimes isn't there. It's not the case that it's bad, it just is non-existent.
That's right. Well, forget your credit history. If you're starting to borrow money, it's very difficult. Indeed. But the great thing about the 1,200 or so startups...
1,700 now.
Well, you see, I've been away 2 weeks, and that's what happens, is that the losses were about 10%.
Yeah, that's right.
And that shows that all the discipline... See, these startups have people who have discipline.
That's right.
It makes a big difference.
And I do get asked that question, why is it that X-Forces Enterprise and the microfinancing is one of the highest? And I believe it's because of the people,
Yeah.
but I also believe it's because of the wraparound support that you insisted on having as part of that funding scheme.
You had to have a mentor,
Yeah.
that was compulsory. Not somebody who's going to run your business for you, but somebody at the other end of a telephone who knows you and knows about the business and can advise. Because I found it a very lonely business starting up in the old days.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was no one to really ask. And so I was reinventing things the whole time and making mistakes.
Well, without those mistakes, we wouldn't be able to achieve what we have achieved. And I've got to say, Lord Young, if it wasn't for that chance meeting at number 10, we wouldn't be sat here today. We wouldn't have helped the people that we've helped. We're really lucky that we've got one that is being, shall we say, mentored and supported by the London Stock Exchange.
Yes.
You know, we may well have, you know, watch this space, a FTSE organisation that's been created just from that seed. And it's a testament and a credit to yourself that these individuals are now become mentors and peer-to-peer support for the newbies.
Yes.
And we wouldn't be able to have had that movement without your support.
And that's key, actually.
Yeah.
People who've done it themselves know what the problems are. If you get somebody who's always been employed in a firm, they really don't know what it's like to start up.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I was very keen on, that when we got to the stage we had enough graduates that they would come and repay in effort, you know.
Yeah, and that's happening, and I think that I'm sure there's lots of other communities that are doing that, but I think it is something that's in the DNA of the armed forces, is never leave your fellow person behind.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And always, you know, if somebody gave you a hand up, it's there.
In a way, we're starting with a lorry load of acorns and we're creating a forest.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take it back to you a little bit on your own journey. If you could have done anything different, Lord Young, what would that have been? Is there anything?
I wouldn't have done anything different, because if I had, I wouldn't be the person I am today. You see, I consider myself wise today. Before you think it's big-headed, my definition of wisdom is the memory of past mistakes. The only time you learn is when things go wrong.
Yes.
When things go right, you assume it's natural. And if I hadn't had the occasional setback, which happened, business didn't work out as well and other things, I wouldn't have learned how to pull them back again.
Yeah. And I think that is the wise words that I take away for myself as well, because we can be hard on ourselves sometimes, and we can sort of think, well, why did I do that way? And actually, through adversity.
But there is one big thing you must be careful of: forgetting what you did, you'll repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
So it is the memory of past mistakes.
Yes. Thank you. Lord Young, under your stewardship, we've achieved a huge amount, not just X-Forces Enterprise, but the whole startup business. Before even I was on the scene, so going back, we've heard a bit about the history. Do you think government could be doing more to help the small business community?
Well, government must ensure it doesn't reduce the support it's giving. I think it gives a good support today, good advice today. But, you know, when I was Secretary of State of Department of Trade and Industry, it was one of the great departments of state. We included the city, we included insurances. Now the business department is nobody knows where it is or anything. And what government, I think, takes for granted is that the wealth of this country, the well-being of its citizens, depend upon the ability to work for themselves. Now the world changes so quickly, it's changed unbelievably since I was young, In fact, I'll give you one example to show you. My first day starting up my first company, my brother was a small accountant. I took a room there. I spent the entire day typing out, picking out, couldn't type then, 36 or 37 letters, went down to the post office, posted them off, did the same the second day, and then I waited. And today you just turn on your PC and you get all that information comes in.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important that we continue with helping people as society evolves, as the economy evolves. You know, the rate of change has not slowed down. It's going up, and artificial intelligence, all the new things that are coming on are going to create enormous opportunities.
Yeah, and we are a nation of innovators and startup, aren't we? We're a nation of small businesses.
Well, we are not what Napoleon called us, a nation of shopkeepers. We are a nation, actually, today we're an enterprise nation. We have more startups, or did last time, I looked at the figures, than proportionally the United States.
Brilliant. And may it continue.
I hope it does.
Thank you.
Thanks.